The Dornier Do X was the largest, the heaviest, the most powerful, and the most complex aircraft in the world when it first took to the skies in July of 1929. Lifting off from Lake Constance, near the Swiss town of Altenrhein, its imposing presence struck awe into all that beheld it, and its roaring engines shattered the peace and serenity of the Alpine countryside. This was no mere flying boat. This was a flying ship. It was a 45-ton, 12-engined, all-metal marvel of engineering, and it represented the dawn of a new era in the world of aviation. This was the first time that heavier-than-air flight had dared to go big. In a time when many aircraft were still made from wood and fabric, and the average passenger transport had primitive amenities and carried no more than a dozen people, the giant all-metal Do X, with its capacity to carry 66 passengers, in a luxury matched only by ocean liners, represented a huge leap forward. The Do X is perhaps my favourite aircraft from the interwar period. I've always had a soft spot for flying boats, and for a long time I've wanted to talk about this particular one. Despite being the first of its kind, despite pioneering numerous advancements in airframe technology, and despite the fact that it was the undisputed heavyweight of the interwar period, not being outclassed in sheer mass until the arrival of the Douglas XB-19 in 1941, the Do X has faded into obscurity. A lot of this was because only 3 were built, and none of them survived beyond 1943. Often, the history of aviation is kept alive by preservation, and without an example of the Do X to see today, it's very hard to appreciate its worth and the fascinating story of its operational life, an international adventure if there ever was one. But with the recent addition of the Do X to Microsoft Flight Simulator, interest in this huge flying ship has exploded, and I've finally got a good enough excuse to spend the better part of 3 hours talking about one of my favourite flying machines. Today, we're going to explore the fascinating history of this giant flying ship, its origins, its technical details, and in general try to shed some light on what I believe to be a highly neglected aviation legend. We're also going to be doing something new, as I recently had the pleasure of speaking with the organizer of an ambitious project that hopes to see the Do X rebuilt and returned to us in all of its long-forgotten glory. So, without further ado, let's begin. The brainchild of Dr. Claude Dornier, a German engineer and aircraft designer, the Do X was one of the most influential aircraft of the interwar period. This was not because it was a roaring commercial success. It wasn't. And it was not because hundreds of them were built. Indeed, only 3 of these giant ships were ever constructed. Instead, it was important from the very fact that it was even built in the first place. In a time of economic uncertainty, and when the development of commercial aircraft appeared to be stalling, Dornier dared to push the boundaries of what a flying machine could be. He set out to prove what many people thought would be impossible for many years to come, that aviation could go big, and that it could do so now. But before we get into the details of the Do X, we need to briefly explore its origins, and that means taking a look at the history of Dr. Dornier and his motivations for building this flying ship in the first place. When the Do X was first conceived in the mid-1920s, Claude Dornier was already a leading name in the field of all-metal aircraft construction. Born in 1884, he graduated from the Munich Technical University in 1907 with a strong passion for engineering, but like many others of his calling, he had also become deeply interested in this new and growing field of aviation. He first became involved in aeronautical engineering 3 years later, when, in 1910, he was given the opportunity to work for the airship manufacturer Zeppelin. Helping to improve the lightweight metal frames that made the giant airships possible, Dornier quickly displayed a natural talent, one that caught the attention of Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin himself, and Dornier found himself being made one of Zeppelin's closest engineering advisors. In 1914, Zeppelin put Dornier in charge of a subdivision that would focus on the development of fixed-wing aircraft. Based at Lindau, an island on the eastern side of Lake Constance, Dornier's first achievement was the development of a series of large flying boats. Zeppelin was hoping to find a customer in the Imperial German Navy, like which he had with his airships. Known simply as the Reisenflugboots, or giant flying boats, these were the largest aircraft in the world at the time of their construction. The first, which was completed in 1915, had an astonishing wingspan of the time of 43.5 meters, and it weighed almost 10 tons. But, more importantly than those figures, their structures were built almost exclusively using metal. These pioneering aircraft will be covered in a special video that more closely explores the early developments of metal airframes in the future. But to keep things short and concise, for one reason or another, sometimes involving the sea, they weren't particularly successful. From the standpoint of construction and metallurgy, however, they were a roaring success, and Dornier was doing even better by land. In late 1917, early 1918, Dornier designed and built the Zeppelin Lindau D1, which was the first aircraft to officially bear his initial, and it was well deserved. With this, Dornier pioneered the use of shell construction within a metal airframe. The fuselage used a framework of ribs which were connected by smooth metal plates to produce an interior space that was free of bracing. This is more commonly known as monocoque construction, and while it had been done before, Dornier was the first to do it using metal alloys, and he was the first to design a wing using this construction method as well. Unfortunately for Dornier, development of this pioneering aircraft was cut short by the collapse of the Central Powers and the Armistice of 1918, with just 7 examples of the D1 being built. Some of these were scrapped, but some were also taken by the victorious Allied powers for evaluation, as, at the time, Germany had been leading the field in the development of all-metal aircraft, mostly thanks to pioneering work done by both Claude Dornier, Zeppelin, and Dornier's contemporary Hugo Junkers. Like most designers in the post-war period, Dornier believed that commercial air travel would soon become as common as travelling by train or by ship, and he shifted focus accordingly. His first design, the GS-1, was a hasty conversion of a flying boat that was initially designed for the Imperial German Navy. But after the formal signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which forbade the production of any German aircraft in the first 6 months, it was scrapped so that it would not have to be surrendered. Following this, Dornier would avoid further difficulties by building most of his aircraft outside Germany during the 1920s, with aircraft being manufactured in Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Japan, just to name a few. He quickly re-established himself as a pioneer of all-metal design, producing the Dornier Delphin, a curious all-metal flying boat that used sponsons instead of wing floats for stability on the water, and which totally did not look like somebody had bolted a couple of wings onto a bread tin and then infused it with the machine spirit. This was followed by the Dornier Comet, which was initially a land-plane derivative of the Delphin, but a design that soon took on its own identity and became a success in its own right, while at the same time transforming itself into something that did not traumatize small children when they looked at it. Considerations on looks aside, both of those designs were successful, but they would pale in comparison to the success of the Dornier Do X, or Whale. First flown in 1922, it would go on to become one of the most successful flying boats of the interwar period, with nearly 300 examples being produced. Built with an all-metal steel and duralumin frame, the Val mounted 2 engines above a strut-braced parasol wing. Depending on the configuration, it accommodated a crew of 2 or 3, and in its commercial variants, as some were designed as military craft, it could carry up to 12 passengers in an enclosed cabin within the hull. Eventually, it would be operated by at least 7 different commercial airlines, seeing use in Brazil, Colombia, Germany, Italy, and Japan, which for the 1920s was a considerable achievement. The Val would also go on to establish the first regular intercontinental airline service, flying a route carrying passengers and mail from Stuttgart in Germany to Natal in Brazil. But long before that particular achievement had even been made, for that air route did not commence until the early 1930s, Dornier was aspiring towards something much bigger. By the mid-1920s, Dornier was growing concerned about two things. Firstly, commercial aviation was struggling to achieve the revolutionary success it had first promised, offering customers a faster, more efficient alternative to travelling by land or sea. And secondly, his company, and German aviation in general, was losing its technological lead. The commercial concern was not unique to Dornier. Many were having doubts about the future of commercial air travel, but of the two, it was the bigger motivator towards the development of the Do X. Up until this point, commercial airlines were small businesses that operated small aeroplanes. And no, I'm not forgetting about commercial airships, which were far more ambitious, but those are a topic for another day. Just focusing on heavy-than-air flight, from 1914 to 1925, commercial air travel had changed relatively little. Yes, there had been some advancements in aircraft technology, new power plants, improved control surfaces, and the growing use of metal in the airframes in place of wood. And yes, this had resulted in some improvements. But thus far, nothing revolutionary had happened to the scale of these designs. For example, one of the first large airliners of the interwar period, and I say the word large in air quotes, was the Farman Goliath, which was basically a late-war French heavy bomber which had been hastily converted to passenger use. This lumbering machine was usually modified to carry between 12 to 15 passengers. If we move forward to the mid-1920s, we see that although aviation technology has dramatically improved over a short time, the capacity of passenger transports has remained the same. The Fokker trimotor, which entered service in 1925, could carry between 6 and 12 passengers. The Junkers G-24, also entering service in 1925, could carry 14. And the Armstrong-Whitworth Argosy, considered to be a large airliner, had a passenger capacity of only 20. The result was that these aircraft weren't very profitable, if they were even profitable at all. There was a reason why passenger transports weren't built in huge numbers during this time, with the Dornier being a very rare exception. They were often expensive to build, and they carried so few passengers that the per-person ticket price meant that it was an expensive and thus exclusive way of travelling. Additionally, air travel was not for the faint-hearted. It was loud, uncomfortable, and nowhere near as safe as air travel is today. And this further reduced the potential market that airline companies were trying to cater to. Not only did their customers need to be rich enough, but they also had to be brave enough. The average person simply wasn't willing to spend a small fortune to be crammed inside a small cabin on a wicker chair, being subjected to over 120 decibels of engine noise, just to get somewhere a little bit faster. Unless things changed, the chosen method of transport to get large numbers of people from A to B would remain in the form of trains or ships. Dornier ran the numbers. The only solution would be to dramatically increase capacity. At the time, a moderate-sized ferry could easily transport 150 or so passengers in style, comfort, and safety, all without bankrupting the passengers in the process. A modern steam train could do the same, pulling no more than 3 passenger cars, and of course they usually took far more than just that, again carrying said passengers in style, comfort, and safety at a reasonable cost. In comparison, and taking the average capacity of air transports of the 1920s into account, an airline would need to operate 12 aircraft simultaneously just to match the capacity of a single train or ferry service, and of course, these could not match the comfort, safety, or affordability of said train or ship. But if an aircraft was made bigger, much bigger, say to accommodate 50 or even 70 passengers, things might change. The increase in size would result in a much bigger cabin, which would allow the installation of more comfortable accommodation for the passengers. It would allow for a larger and more robust airframe, which would improve safety. A larger airframe would also allow the installation of multiple power plants, which further improved safety by adding a layer of redundancy. And, if everything was managed properly, and built to acceptable costs, this design would be far more economically viable. After all, 70 passengers would bring in far more money than just 12, and while the aircraft would initially cost more to develop and build, it would eventually pay for itself far sooner. It was this realization that set Claude Dornier down the path to develop the Do X, and his motivation was redoubled when he also realized that this could be the solution to his other problem, keeping his company in the lead. For years, Germany had been at the forefront of developing all-metal aircraft, but following the war, with various designs being surrendered to old enemies and others being exported to new friends, the rest of the world was catching up. The early designs of Dornier and Junkers had been popular because they were the best, but if they wanted to remain the best, the German designers had to produce something new and innovative, ideally something revolutionary, something that could not be easily replicated by other countries without investing much time and resources. If Dornier could figure out how to design and build a new passenger transport, one on a scale that totally eclipsed the current class, he would not only revolutionize commercial air travel, but he would re-establish German engineering as the leading force in aviation technology. With this new goal in mind, Dornier began to draw up various concepts, aided by his chief design engineer Albert Presser. From the very beginning, the plan had been to build the aircraft as a large flying boat, or rather, a flying ship, as Dornier would insist upon. Dornier had begun to experiment with the idea of a large flying ship as early as 1919, but he had shelved those plans because of the immediate effects of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the case was altered, as he had the option to seek out manufacturing facilities overseas, and Dornier would have gone further with his plans if it weren't for a single but insurmountable problem: money. The ink had barely dried on the design drawings for Dornier Project 1190, a design study for a giant flying ship which looked somewhat like a whale wearing a surfboard as a hat, before Dornier and Presser realized that developing a giant flying ship was going to be more expensive than they had originally estimated. Not only was designing and building something this large going to be expensive on its own, from the standpoint of materials, engines, etc., but it would also require the establishment of a new factory, as none at Dornier's disposal were big enough, and the employment and training of a large workforce. With the German economy still struggling to recover from the effects of the First World War, Dornier thought it would be impossible to find an investor for such an ambitious project. For over a year, he would continue to draw up hypothetical plans for his giant flying ship, and, unknown to himself at the time, he actually drew up the basic template for what would become the Do X almost 5 years later, but none of these drawings were done with much hope. Instead, he refocused his efforts on the Dornier Val, which was proving to be far more successful than he had originally planned. But then, in July of 1925, a new opportunity presented itself. One day, Dornier was having breakfast with the president of the German Aerospace Industry Association, one Captain Lars of the German Navy. He asked Dornier if, hypothetically speaking, somebody were to give him a giant pile of money, would he consider building a giant flying boat? Perhaps something larger than what anyone else has yet attempted before? For his part, and hypothetically speaking of course, Dornier was more than ready to jump on board with such a plan. After a few more questions about probable payload and capabilities, Dornier suggested a flying ship of about 50 loaded tons weight with a wingspan of at least 45 meters, something not unlike the designs he had been drafting over the past year or so, would be an acceptable concept. But he was skeptical that his hypothetical benefactor understood the true cost of such an undertaking, Building an aircraft of this size would literally cost a fortune. A third man, the hypothetical benefactor made manifest, then joined their impromptu design meeting/breakfast. Though he was not named, it was highly likely that this was Captain Walter Lohmann, who was head of the Naval Sea Transport Division. He assured Dornier that the money that he required for such a project would be available, and simply asked Dornier straight out how many millions he would need. Somewhat flabbergasted, Dornier could not give a direct answer on the spot. He would need far more time to make preliminary design drawings to even come up with a rough estimate for such a thing. But his hypothetical benefactor was unconcerned. He told Dornier that he would give him the time and the complete freedom to see the project through. Once an initial design had been drawn up and costs estimated, they would finalize the agreements and sign a contract. Dornier was not allowed to ask directly who his investors were. He was simply told in no uncertain terms that the contracts would be signed with the Ministry of Transportation and the money would come to him from that department. Dornier was almost certain, as historians and scholars are almost certain, that his new mysterious investor was the German Navy. However, even today, the details of this arrangement are not completely clear. The Navy may have wanted the Do X as a giant transport. It may have wanted it as a mine layer or as a large torpedo carrier. Or it could have wanted a large, long-range reconnaissance and maritime patrol aircraft, sort of like the short Sunderland that would be operated by Britain later on in World War II. In the end, we just don't know the whole story, and by this point we probably never will. What we do know is that Claude Dornier was not going to pass up the giant pile of money that was being laid at his feet to fund the development of his dream flying ship, no matter the nebulous and clandestine nature of his investors. And so, shortly afterwards, he would sign 2 contracts with the Ministry of Transportation. The first contract was for the allocation of funds for the construction of a new factory at a price of 2 million marks, and the second was for the design and construction of the first flying ship at a price of 1.5 million. This was essentially to be treated as the prototype, and providing it was a success, Claude Dornier was told a production order would be forthcoming. Now, with all that said, it does beg the question: how does this contract, which, reading between the lines, is asking for a military flying ship, lead to the passenger-carrying Do X that we all know today? Well, it's a little bit complicated, and in the interest of keeping this discussion vaguely concise, I'm going to condense the facts so that we actually focus on the aircraft itself. But in a broad nutshell, the Do X could not be built in Germany, due to various restrictions from the Treaty of Versailles. The Swiss government takes an interest in Dornier's plans, and a deal is brokered to build his new factory on the shore of the Swiss side of Lake Constance, near the town of Altenrhein. To facilitate the construction of the new factory, as well as to finance the development and production of the Do X, a new public company is formed, Dornier Flugzeug AG. The German government takes a 51% stake, and the rest was split between Claude Dornier himself and his company back in Germany. As the new company breaks ground on its new factory, Claude Dornier and Albert Presser continue the monumental task of designing the largest aircraft in the world. Between early 1925 and December of 1926, the design of the Do X goes through countless iterations, some details of which we will discuss shortly. Unfortunately, the actual construction of the Do X gets delayed by a full year, because the construction of the factory hits multiple problems. More land had to be dredged near the lake than expected, and building the foundations for the self-supporting assembly hangars eventually requires over 12 kilometers of reinforced concrete piles. This delay had 2 significant knock-on effects. Firstly, it allowed the German Navy enough time to supposedly lose interest in the idea of a giant flying boat. And secondly, it forced the German government to inject more capital into the company, as the cost of factory construction had run 1.5 million marks over the 2 million budget already. This meant that the government now had a majority controlling stake of 76% over Dornier Flugzeug AG, and it now had to figure out what on earth it was going to do with the Do X now that the German Navy appeared to be no longer interested. The solution was to use the Do X as a giant commercial transport, ideally for transatlantic air routes, which was what Dornier had initially wanted anyway, and it was something that he had secretly factored into the design. Additionally, the Do X could also serve as a huge mail carrier, owing to its planned payload capacity. And as it would be the first of its kind in the world, it was hoped that some countries, like the United States for example, would want to purchase export models of the Do X for themselves. Perhaps even pay a hefty sum for license production. Supporters of this new plan, which included Dornier himself, unsurprisingly, then received early encouragement when the first foreign order for the Do X arrived before the prototype had even left its slipway. In 1928, the Italian government, after some serious prompting from General Italo Balbo, who was a fervent advocate of flying boats, placed an order for 2 flying ships to be delivered for the Italian Navy in 1930. Of course, nobody at the time knew that this would be the only foreign order for the Do X, and that is a discussion for later. But the Italian order renewed confidence in Dornier and his plan, and the government was more than happy to sign off on converting the Do X from what had essentially begun as a military project, although not officially of course, to something purely commercial. Again, that was a very condensed version of events, and to be clear, there is some debate between sources on the exact motivations of various parties. Some say that Dornier had a lot more influence on the changes than others, some put more influence on the German government as they were funding it, and some just gloss over this entire part of the affair as it's vaguely confusing, and simply say that it was a military project that turned into a civil one. Now, with that little half-hour tangent out of the way, we can move on to the actual design and construction of the Do X, and then we will have a look at its fascinating operational life. As mentioned earlier, it took Dornier almost 2 years to finalise the eventual design of the Do X. Regardless as to whether he was building the flying ship for the German Navy or future commercial airlines, his design goals remained the same: carry a huge payload, and this meant building a huge flying ship. Before the detailed design work could even begin, a large number of theoretical and scientific investigations had to be made. The sheer size of the projected airframe called for much work in determining the correct use of structural members, material thicknesses, airfoil designs, hull forms, the list goes on. And to reduce any chance of complications, it was decided that no unnecessary innovations would be used in the flying ship's construction. Only tried and tested concepts would be employed, and while this did limit the full potential of what the Do X could have been, it was considered an acceptable compromise in the pursuit of reliability and safety. Following the initial investigations, detailed design work appears to have begun in early 1926, with work progressing rapidly. Unfortunately, almost all of the original design drawings of the Do X have been lost, so it's impossible to say how much the design changed between that time and when construction began in December of 1927. It is known that most of the design was locked in by June of that year, as by that point Dornier's design team had constructed a series of scale models to verify the accuracy of the blueprints. This included a remarkable 1:1 scale model that was constructed from wood, which on its own could be considered a marvel of craftsmanship. Erected in an old hangar outside Lindau, it allowed the design team to evaluate the critical construction details of the flying ship, and made sure there weren't any embarrassing surprises when they built the Do X proper. As it would happen, all 3 of the flying ships were built almost simultaneously. The prototype was begun first, with work beginning on December the 19th, 1927, and a few months later construction also began on the two Italian models. Collectively, they are known as the Do X 1, 2, and 3. And aside from the power plants, which were different, they were almost completely structurally identical. Now, I don't usually go into mega deep detail on an aircraft's construction, but I'm making an exception today because the Do X itself was an exceptional machine for its time. Firstly, there was the sheer size of it. The airframe had a length of 40.05 meters, a wingspan of 47.8 meters, and a maximum height of 10.25 meters, including the engines and propellers. The hull had a maximum width of 4.8 meters without sponsons, 10.6 meters with them, and it had a maximum height of 6.4 meters. Empty, it weighed 23.3 metric tons, and it was rated for a normal loaded takeoff weight of 45 tons. Later on, following modifications in 1930, including a change in power plant, the normal takeoff weight would increase further to 48.5 tons, and the Do X 1 would have a maximum takeoff weight of 51.3 tons in ideal weather conditions. For 1929, these were impressive numbers, and as it turned out, the Do X would be the most massive aircraft flown during the interwar period. The only other aircraft that could match it was the Tupolev AN-T-20, flown 5 years later in the Soviet Union. This had a broader wingspan, but it did not match the Do X's carrying capacity. The Do X would not be fully eclipsed in this class until 1941, when the massive Douglas XB-19 finally took to the skies in the United States. But it wasn't just the physical dimensions and its huge weight that made the Do X exceptional, it was also a marvel of engineering. Even though Dornier had omitted any unnecessary innovations in the design, its massive size meant that almost every aspect of its construction pushed aeronautical engineering into new territory. Take the engines, for example. Power would come from 12 engines arranged into 6 tandem pairs. On the Do X1 as it was originally completed, these were Siemens-built Bristol Jupiters. They produced a maximum of 500 horsepower each, giving the Do X approximately 6,000 horsepower available at takeoff. These were mounted above the main wing, which was deemed to be the most suitable location. Not only did it keep the engines far away from any potential water spray, but the prop wash would be directed over the tail control surfaces, increasing the effectiveness of the rudder and the elevator. Dornier had gone for radial engines partly because of their lightness compared to liquid-cooled engines, but mostly because of the fact that they were being built by Siemens. The German government, having a majority stake in the endeavour, had insisted on a German engine being used, and although the Jupiter was a British-designed power plant, the fact that it was being built in Germany was enough to satisfy their requirements. Now, early photos of the Do X1 show a small wing-like structure connecting these engines. Despite some claims to the contrary, this was not designed as a secondary lifting surface, but merely as a lateral support structure for the engines themselves. This was later replaced by 2 spar-like structures when the Do X1 was taken in for modifications in 1930, and it's why most photos and contemporary models of the Do X, including the one in Flight Simulator, do not feature it, unless they were specifically trying to recreate the Do X as it was first completed. Originally, the Do X had been planned with just 7 engines of a much higher power output. However, these were newer power plants that were not deemed as reliable, and Dornier decided to err on the side of caution. His team took the same approach with the construction of the flying ship's massive wing. It was a semi-cantilever design that made use of 3 main spars. A full cantilever wing was contemplated earlier on, but it was abandoned as it produced too much weight and too much complexity to be desirable. The framework for the skin of this wing was built in sections. These were inserts that were comprised of a duralumin frame which fit in the rectangular spaces that were made by the intersecting spars and ribs. This made it possible to conduct quick repairs on the wing surface, as only a small section would need to be removed. This ease of repair was a point of importance for Dornier, as the flying ship might travel to remote regions that offered little in the way of shore-based facilities. But this modular design approach wasn't the only thing that made it easy to maintain the structure of the Do X's giant wing. Because of its size, or more specifically its thickness, a crawl space was built into the design, running along the wing's entire span behind the front spar. This allowed an engineer, one ideally not given to claustrophobic tendencies, to examine the interior of the most important parts of the wing structure. This crawl space also intersected with the vertical frame of the engine nacelles, and it extended upward so that the engines, oil, and fuel lines could all be individually examined during flight. The control surfaces of the wing were of a typical design, each equipped with their own balancing surfaces. The tail was a sescoplane, featuring a small tailplane directly on the rear of the hull, and a main tailplane positioned higher, both connected to the hull with struts. Instead of using a horn balance or servo rudder, the rudder balances were vertical surfaces that were located between the upper and lower tailplanes. The control surfaces were operated using steel rods, or tubes, which hung from pendulum cranks and made use of ball bearings for smooth movement. Because of this, the elevators and rudder could be finely adjusted by altering the angle of the balancing surfaces from the cockpit. This required minimal effort, and reportedly, this would be one of the biggest surprises of the Do X, at least as far as its critics were concerned, as many people believed that an aircraft of such size and mass would be far too difficult to control for long-distance flying. Now, speaking of size and mass, there is of course the Dornier Do X's hull to consider. Calling it a flying ship was not only appropriate from the point of aesthetics, as from the outside it really did look like an ocean liner that had sprouted wings out of nowhere, but structurally and internally it was designed as a ship first and a flying machine second. The hull was a complex piece of engineering, as we can see from the image here. It was built around 58 transverse frames, or ribs, and a 23.3-meter keelson. Some of these ribs also served as bulkheads, which allowed the hull to be divided into 9 watertight compartments. These, combined with 8 additional watertight compartments in the sponsons, 4 each, provided the Do X with a huge amount of reserve displacement. Internally, it was divided into 3 decks. The upper deck, often known as the control deck or command deck, the middle deck, which was designed mostly for the passengers, and the lower deck, which contained the fuel tanks and cargo hold. The control deck held the cockpit, sometimes called the bridge, the navigation and command room, the main engine room, the radio station, and the auxiliary engine room. It was run very much like a ship. The Do X had a captain and a crew under him. Depending on the year and how the Do X was operated, its crew complement varied between 13 and 19 officers and men. The cockpit had seating for 2 pilots, with dual controls for steering, trim adjustment, water rudder steering, and the necessary flight instruments for maintaining course and control. The pilots had little to do with the monitoring and control of the engines, though. Their job was to pilot the Do X, and it was the responsibility of those in the engine room to keep it running. Aside from their flight instruments, the pilots only had 2 collective RPM gauges, one for the engine groups on the port and starboard side each, and 2 collective throttles for the same purpose. Individual control of the engines, powering on, shutting down, etc., was all done by the engine room, though the pilots did have a bypass switch to shut down the entire power plant should an emergency arise. Behind the cockpit was the command and navigation room. On the port side, it had a chart table, complete with embedded compass and a built-in cabin clock. This is where the captain would spend most of his time, as he was directly between the pilots in the cockpit and the head engineer in the engine room directly aft. Standing in this room, it really did feel like you were on board a ship, rather than on something designed to fly in the air. Not only did this room have 2 massive banks of engine instruments and controls, but it had no windows whatsoever. nor did the rest of the command deck going aft, as it would intersect with the centre section of the wing. On each side of the engine room, 2 small ladders would lead up to the aforementioned crawl spaces built into the wing, and this allowed the engineer to quickly access its interior and the individual engines if required. Behind the engine room, and soundproofed as much as possible from the roar of 12 aero engines overhead, there was the radio room. Its layout appears to change over the years. However, it seems that most of the equipment was installed on the port side, and in some photos you can clearly see a hand wheel connected to a vertical shaft, which was used to control the direction of the antenna loop which would be mounted overhead. Finally, at the extreme rear of the command deck, there was the auxiliary engine room. This appears to be the least documented part of the command deck, so I don't want to commit myself too far on the details, but it appears to have contained a 12 to 15 horsepower 2-cylinder DKW engine. This was used to drive a generator, as well as the air compressor which was used to start the main engines. Moving down to the main deck, we start with a collision room in the bow, forward of the first bulkhead. Aft of this are the main cabins which would be occupied by the passengers. The size of these rooms was dictated by the hull's bulkheads, and their furnishings would differ based on the Do X's planned commercial route. For short-haul flights, it was intended to seat up to 100 passengers, but for longer international routes it would seat 66. However, in most contemporary depictions of the Do X, the seating capacity is even less, focusing more on luxury and comfort. A lot of this is influenced by the Italian Do X's, which were eventually configured to carry just 24 passengers. But this was not because they wanted luxury over capacity, it was instead because of various financial problems with outfitting and operating the flying ships, something we will get to later. No matter the configuration, the Do X offered its passengers far more than the average aircraft of its day. Not only did it provide a spacious cabin for its passengers, equipped with fine carpet, plush seats, and many portholes to view the outside world, but it came with the facilities of an ocean-going liner. The Do X had a smoking room and a bar. Behind the main cabins there was a full cloakroom, 2 restrooms with washing facilities, and at the stern, hidden behind the crew quarters, there was a fully equipped electric galley, and the passengers would be served their meals not just on any old plate, but on fine porcelain. Admittedly, these meals on the Do X were of the cold variety, as the electric galley was mostly used for boiling water and not roasting a pheasant, but even so, having your meal served up on fine porcelain definitely beats a tinfoil container and a plastic cup. Moving on from the relative opulence of the main deck, we come to the lower deck. This is the most reinforced section of the hull, as it has to absorb the forces of the water, and through its centre ran the vertical keelson, which served to both reinforce the hull even further and support the floor of the passenger deck above. The cargo hold lay in the section directly behind the forward collision bulkhead, and after this, behind many more bulkheads, were the oil and fuel tanks. The main oil tank held 1,300 litres. The normal fuel load of the Do X was 16,000 litres, but this could be increased by a further 6,000 litres at the expense of a reduced passenger capacity. All of this fuel was housed on the lower deck, and it was pumped up to a pair of 300-litre collecting tanks in the leading edge of the wing via an electric pumping system, and there was, of course, a manual backup if required. The complexities of the hull, the wingspan of 47.8 metres, the empty weight of 28 tonnes, the presence of no less than 12 aero engines, and just the sheer massiveness of the Do X absolutely stunned the German and international press when it was formally unveiled on July 9th, 1929. The construction of the first Do X had taken 570 days and 240,000 working hours to complete. The engineering team had been forced to overcome numerous challenges, developed new methods of assembly, built new tooling, and had been forced to erect a massive outdoor set of scales to make sure that the giant flying ship had not completed overweight. But at last, Claude Dornier's massive flying ship was finally complete. There was just one big elephant in the room to address. Would the Do X even fly? Well, over the coming days, a series of tests showed that upon leaving the slipway, it could float, which was admittedly a good start. It could taxi on the water under power, getting better, and it could get up to takeoff speed on the water while remaining perfectly stable. Excellent. Indeed, during one high-speed run, it actually left the water for a few moments, which technically could have been classed as its first flight. But during this event, 2 of the engines also stopped working. They were up and running again by the end of the day, but Dornier's team were a little concerned that the constant power output of the radials seemed to fluctuate. However, it was still producing more than enough to get the Do X airborne, and the first flight was officially scheduled for the 12th of July. At the controls was Chief Test Pilot Richard Wagner. Of no relation to the composer, but I'd like to imagine he was quietly humming Ride of the Valkyries as he took off. And among the 13 other crew members of this historic flight, there was also Heinrich Frohlind, Dornier's chief of testing and a highly skilled engineer. Dornier's scheme had attracted its fair share of skeptics. Many believed that the Do X was too heavy to fly. Others believed the wings provided inadequate lift, and some doubted the hull could withstand the punishing forces that would be inflicted upon it. It was with no small sense of relief, then, that Claude Dornier saw his flying ship lift itself out of the water and take to the sky. It was only a short flight, less than a quarter of an hour, but it proved that the Do X could safely take off, orbit the lake, and land again. A series of extensive test flights soon followed, where the Do X quickly displayed remarkable handling that contradicted its lumbering appearance. Dornier's choice of engine layout was also confirmed. During tests, the Do X could still maintain full control, without any additional rudder input, if it suffered a failure of a port or starboard engine pair. It could also still maintain flight if it lost up to 4 engines, though depending on which ones failed, a certain amount of control input would be required to correct any directional instability. After its 20th test flight, the Do X was put on display to the general public for the first time. Between the 24th and 25th of August, over 50,000 people visited Altenrhein to get an up-and-close look at the Do X. It was still completely unfurnished. The passenger cabin was nothing but a metallic shell, but crowds of people still climbed all over the erected scaffolding to peer inside, and wondered to themselves what it might soon look like. Unfortunately for them, the Do X did not fly that weekend. It was still undergoing official testing, and all flights thus far were done as secretly as possible. Official flying finally began towards the end of September, and it would culminate with a record-setting event that took place on October the 21st. This was the 42nd flight of the Do X, and it was to be both a demonstration of its lifting capacity and also to serve as a press demonstration for international reporters. Dornier invited members of the press to board his flying ship for the first time, but he also then extended the invitation to the workers and engineers who helped build the Do X in the first place, and then he extended the invitation to their families as well. Officially, the flight was meant to carry 160 people, but the Do X was subject to 9 stowaways in the form of excitable children, and to be completely fair, if I was a child with potential access to a giant flying boat, I know damn well I would be taking advantage of that as well. After takeoff, with 169 people on board, the Do X flew around Lake Constance for over 40 minutes, and in doing so, it set a new passenger record which would not be beaten for 20 years. The Do X was not going to break any speed records on that day. Indeed, it could barely manage more than 210 kilometers per hour, but for most people that didn't matter, especially in Germany. Claude Dornier had just built the biggest aircraft in the world, and he had given them all a glimpse of the future of air travel. This record flight, and the ones before it, soon earned the Do X international fame. Dornier's critics were forced to concede their defeat, and the Do X was hailed as a triumph of aeronautical engineering. All over the world, newspapers and various aeronautical magazines sang Dornier's praises. They called the Do X the Leviathan of the sky, the mightiest airplane that ever flew, the German wondership of the future, etc. The accolades went on. But behind the scenes, all was not going as well as one might think. After the Do X had completed its record-setting flight, after the happy crowd of reporters, factory workers, and local townspeople had dispersed, Dornier and his team looked up at his flying ship with marked concern. The engines were pretty much cooked. In fact, the rear engines of the Do X had begun to smoke heavily by the time it landed back down on Lake Constance. Initially, it had been calculated that the engines had a maximum output of 500 horsepower for takeoff, and a continuous output of 400 to 420 horsepower under normal running conditions for cruising. However, calculating an engine's normal power output, once the propellers, gearing, and natural resistances had been taken into account, was not yet a perfected art form, and in reality, the engines only had a normal output of around 310 horsepower. This was not enough to keep the Do X aloft at cruising speeds. In fact, it could not even reach its planned cruising altitude of 500 meters, and the engines thus had to be run harder than expected. This caused problems with overheating, and despite attempts to direct more cooling air onto them via additional ducting, it was clear that the Bristol Jupiters weren't up to the task. Dornier had to find a new engine. Only liquid-cooled engines seemed to promise the continuous power output required, but the problem was they were much more heavier and more expensive than air-cooled radials. Dornier.H, the company responsible for the Do X, was getting strapped for cash. The development of the Do X had cost more than expected, and unless things changed, it appeared that the flying ship was at risk of being grounded, or beached, I suppose. Dornier finally found a solution to his engine problem, though it rather annoyed several people in government, by sourcing an engine built overseas in the United States. The Curtiss Conqueror was the only engine available that was powerful enough and cheap enough to keep the Do X flying. It was a relatively lightweight water-cooled V12. It had a maximum output of 610 horsepower, and Curtiss had promised a continuous output of 410 to 420. A deal was struck. Curtiss would supply 12 of its engines to Dornier.H, and in return, the Do X was to travel across the Atlantic and tour the eastern coast of the United States. After all, what could possibly be a better advertisement for Curtiss's new power plant than to have it driving the largest and most ambitious aircraft ever built? This also happened to tie in well with a scheme that was being discussed between Dornier.H, the Ministry of Transport, and the Reichspost, the German mail service. The problem was that the cost of developing, building, and testing the Do X had significantly exceeded the budget of the initial contract. The plan was to build it for 1.5 million marks, and thus far it had cost over 2.8 million. The Ministry of Transport, and the German government in general, was getting a little bit irritated at this rising cost, and they wanted proof that the Do X could eventually be operated for a profit. It was decided to maximize the profitability of the Do X by offering it as not only a passenger transport, but also as an airmail carrier as well. In fact, it was suggested to use the Do X as the world's first flying/floating post office. The Do X could fly to various locations along a planned international route, say going from Germany to America via Europe, Africa, and South America, dropping off airmail and passengers like other aircraft of the time. But it would also have a postmaster on board that could process new mail coming into it. This meant that it could take mail from point A to point Z, pick up mail from point B to take to point C, D, and E, etc., and of course the cost of postage and stamps could be paid to the postmaster aboard the Do X. Dornier decided that he would test this scheme with the Atlantic crossing to America. This flight was being borne at the company's expense, as being a long-distance proving flight, it of course could not carry passengers, and it was not certified to do so. And if he could make this flight not cost his company any money, he was of course going to take the opportunity. As the finer details of this plan took shape, the Curtiss Conqueror engines were shipped over, and the Do X was modified to adapt to them. Owing to a lack of time and funds, Dornier could not fully redesign the engine nacelles and wing struts to accommodate the new engines, and the design was stripped down to a bare frame. Unfortunately for the onboard engineers, this meant they now had to climb a ladder which was exposed to the slipstream if they wanted to directly access the engines for servicing or repairs. As a quick side point here, on the Do X 2 and 3 this would not be the case. The Italians were paying to have liquid-cooled Fiat engines installed from the outset, and Dornier.H had time to redesign the engine nacelles and their supporting framework to accommodate them. They also made ingenious use of the support structure by fitting the radiators into the leading edge. This allowed the engine nacelle itself to be shaped into a more streamlined design, which helped to significantly reduce drag. Following its modifications, and now known as the Do X 1A, the flying ship made its first flight with the new Curtiss engines on August 4, 1930. In between test flights, work continued on furnishing the Do X's interior, a task which had begun almost a year earlier. Dornier wanted his flying ship to be shown at its best, and he had it furnished to the height of comfort and luxury. He worked with Jacob Keller & Company, with interior designer Emil Rau, planning out the fine details of the flying ship's interior. Unfortunately, not many photos exist of the interior of the Do X as it was completed before this international flight, and none of those photos were captured in colour. Most contemporary drawings and models base the colour scheme of the interior on illustrations by Klaus Bergen. He'd risen to fame with his dramatic paintings that depicted naval warfare during the First World War, and having expressed a keen interest in this newfangled flying ship, he was brought in to illustrate the interior of the Do X for a promotional magazine. During his visit, at some point in mid to late 1930, he bumped into Emil Rau, the two got on well, and he also ended up producing at least 5 illustrations for Jacob Keller's interior design pamphlet. These illustrations are what are often used as reference material when building interior models of the Do X today. However, it must be stressed that these illustrations cannot be considered wholly accurate, as Jacob Keller demanded some artistic license be taken to show the Do X in a very favourable way. Basically, they wanted it to look as luxurious as possible, and some of the drawings depict it being outfitted with furnishings that Jacob Keller were producing, but weren't quite ready when the Do X would leave for its international trip. The Do X was scheduled to depart on its transcontinental journey on October the 30th, and the interior design work was barely finished before this date arrived. Indeed, some corners had to be cut, and the furnishings of the flying ship weren't completed exactly how Dornier had wished. This was partly due to the fact that Dornier had to keep any added weight as low as possible, so as to reduce the strain on the engines for this first experimental crossing of the Atlantic Ocean, and partly because Dornier.H's financial troubles prevented any further outlay. But Dornier was no longer alone in its financial difficulties. The knock-on effects of the 1929 Wall Street crash were beginning to be felt as the Great Depression began to take hold. The timing for the Do X could not have been worse. Its planned cost of 1.5 million marks had ballooned to over 2.8 million, and now Dornier was sending his flying ship over the Atlantic to a nation on the brink of financial Armageddon in the hopes of selling it to them. Unfortunately, there was nothing to be done. Dornier was bound by contract with Curtiss to send the Do X across the Atlantic, and Dornier.H had to at least break even on this trip, otherwise the incoming loan repayments owed to the German government would send it bankrupt within a year. It was under this shade of uncertainty that the Do X was prepared for its international journey, with the date of departure being set for October the 30th, 1930. It was crewed by 18 officers and men, and, curiously, 3 of the people aboard would carry the title of captain. It was commanded by Captain Friedrich Christiansen. It was piloted by Captain Horst Meers, and Captain Wilhelm Niemann served as the navigation officer and as postmaster. Niemann was not a captain by military rank, however he was rated as a skipper for international waters by maritime law. This was important, as the Do X was being treated as a seagoing vessel for this international journey. This was being done to make the arrival at ports of call easier, as many countries had not yet established laws that governed international air travel. The flying ship was treated as a ship. It would land on the water at least 3 miles out from its destination port, and it would navigate in under its own power. The Do X carried a ship's registration and papers. Captain Christiansen hired his crew as a sea captain would hire his people, and each of them received a seaman's record book and rating. Each member of the 18-man crew had been hand-picked, either for particular skills or due to an outstanding service record. However, Dornier.H was picky to the point of obsession, and some crew members were not finalised until almost to the 11th hour, with a few just having a handful of days to come aboard and get acclimated to their new floating/flying home. They received a slight reprieve when the departure date was pushed back from October the 30th to November the 5th. This was not done for the crew's benefit, but rather because the Reichspost had left it to almost the last minute to authorise the postal operations aboard the Do X. The postal service was not opened until October the 21st, and Niemann was not sworn in as the postmaster until the 29th. This, combined with the astonishing decision of the Reichspost to charge 6 marks for a 20-gram international letter during a time of economic uncertainty, meant that less than 10% of the expected mail load had arrived. Even after delaying for more than a week, less than half of the expected mail was piling up at the post office based in Friedrichshafen. In the end, the Do X took off with no mail at all. The Reichspost extended the mailing deadline again, and the accumulated mail would be sent down to Portugal, with the city of Lisbon being the planned departure point for the flying ship's transatlantic leg. And so, the Do X airmail service wasn't going to actually begin its journey as an airmail service at all. This was not a good start for the Do X and its crew, especially as the wages of said crew largely depended on the selling of postage stamps and stationery. But the crowd gathering at the shore of Lake Constance was blissfully unaware of this problem, and the flying ship still took off to cheers and fanfare. This international flight was a huge source of national pride, and it was expected to show the world that Germany was still at the forefront of aeronautical engineering. On that point at least, the adventure of the Do X would be a roaring success, but from a business standpoint it was almost a complete failure. The Do X left Lake Constance at 10:30 am on November the 5th in 1930. It would not return to Germany until 6:27 p.m. on the 24th of May, 1932, over 20 months later. Its remarkable and unexpectedly long-lived journey is best summed up by a simple timeline. The first stage saw the Do X visit several European countries along a meandering route that eventually took it to Portugal. It followed the Rhine River from Lake Constance all the way to Amsterdam, where it stayed from November the 6th until the 9th. Despite a constant drizzling rain and near-freezing conditions, thousands of people would swarm onto the dikes, rooftops, or anything of vague height to catch a glimpse of the huge flying ship as it made its approach. After collecting mail bound for the United States, the Do X took off for an impromptu detour across the English Channel, heading off to visit RAF Calshot. During its brief stay, it not only played host to officers of the Royal Navy, but also for the Prince of Wales, who got taken up for a few laps around Southampton Water, where, once again, thousands of people were gathering to watch the giant flying ship pass by overhead. After that, it was back across the channel to France, where the Do X had to overcome that particular body of water which makes any European seafarer uneasy, the Bay of Biscay. As per usual for November, it produced some deeply unpleasant weather. Fog, rain, storms, heavy swells, you name it. But the weatherly Do X endured. It made a stop at La Rochelle during heavy rain, sheltered in Bordeaux following an abortive attempt to Spain, owing to a worsening storm, and it finally reached Lisbon on November the 27th, following stops at Santander, Coruña, and Vigo. It was at Lisbon that the Do X suffers its first major delay. A piece of tarp laid out to dry got blown over one of the engines, and the hot exhaust starts a fire that burned away a huge chunk of the wing's fabric covering. It was a rotten bit of luck, but Dornier's decision to build sectioned wing panels pays dividends, as the Do X was able to be repaired on the spot. Unfortunately, this did take some time as they had to wait for new materials to arrive from Germany, and the Do X was not fit to fly again until the end of January 1931. The delay had allowed more mail to come aboard though, which was a comfort, as thus far the Do X had accumulated less than planned. Most countries in Europe maintained an ironclad monopoly on their postal services. Britain and Spain allowed no mail to go aboard the Do X at all, the French authorities spent too long negotiating costs, and thus it was mainly the Dutch, German, and Portuguese mail that was sitting in the Do X when it prepared to cross the Atlantic. Taking off from Lisbon on January the 30th, the Do X then travelled to the Canary Islands. The plan was to then hop over to the Cape Verdes, and then across the Atlantic to Natal in Brazil. Unfortunately, bad luck struck again. On the 3rd of February, during its takeoff run, the Do X caught a large swell on its starboard sponson, whilst travelling at over 130 km per hour. The impact was almost strong enough to rip the wing clean off by sheer force of deceleration, and the flying ship had to spend almost 3 months in Las Palmas undergoing structural repairs. During this time, the Do X crew are then paid a visit by Italian Aviation Minister Italo Balbo. Having ordered 2 Do X's for Italy, he was expected to be disappointed with what he saw. However, he was actually impressed that the Do X had survived such an encounter with so little damage. A few months earlier, Balbo himself had completed his own crossing of the Atlantic, flying a squadron of Savoy Marchetti S-55s. He made the recommendation that the Do X should make a different crossing. It should travel down to Baloma in West Africa and cross closer to the equator. The weather was calmer, and the distance travelled across the open ocean was considerably less. In May, following repairs, the Do X flew down to Western Africa and then hopped over to Porto Praia. There, it had to reduce its fuel load and send the furnishings across the Atlantic by ship, as, embarrassingly, it could not take off with a full loaded weight of 50 tons in the hot, humid air. It finally made the Atlantic crossing on June the 4th, flying just 5 meters above the ocean to make use of ground effect, which would have been a fun trial had the sea got anything of a swell going. And it finally arrived safely in Natal that afternoon, attracting a huge crowd of local people. Following a 10-day stop, the Do X then set off again. But instead of heading north to the United States, it took a southern route to Rio de Janeiro. This was because a large amount of the mail thus far loaded aboard the Do X was actually bound for that city. It arrived on the 20th of June, attracting tens of thousands of people, and it dropped off nearly 1/4 ton of letters and postcards. Following a stay in Rio, where the Do X made all the major headlines and hosted special guests and government officials, it finally began the long journey north on August the 5th. Mercifully, the rest of the journey passed almost without incident, with just one short delay being caused by a broken crankshaft in one of the engines. This would be the flying ship's only engine problem for the entirety of its international trip, and it was a testament to the reliability of the Curtiss Conqueror. In just 17 days, the Do X made 15 stops on its way to New York, collecting more mail along the way, and it finally arrived at its destination on August the 27th, 1931. The arrival of the giant flying ship was a sensational event. The people had had more than enough time to build up the hype, especially with its every move being followed by the press, and tens of thousands of people watched the Do X loom over New York City and then touch down on the Hudson River. For Dornier and the crew of the Do X, it would be the crowning moment of the ship's flying career. Over the coming weeks in New York, the Do X became a major attraction. Photos of it bobbing up and down on the Hudson River soon circulated in all the major newspapers. It played host to journalists, celebrities, members of state, and paying members of the public who wanted to get up and close with the world's largest aircraft. But, as brilliant as it all was, this great triumph was eclipsed by a sad series of events, some of which had begun several months before the Do X had even crossed the Atlantic. Within weeks of the Do X leaving Germany for its grand adventure, the fate of Dornier.H had already been sealed, and with it, the Do X's future. In 1926, the original cost of building the Do X had been set at 1.5 million marks. By 1928, it had risen to 2.3 million, and after its final modifications in 1930, the total cost paid out by the Transport Ministry was 3.96 million. The Transport Ministry paid this excessive cost, becoming the de facto owners of the Do X outright, but no further orders would come from the government. No follow-up orders had arrived from Italy, and due to the growing economic crisis, there was no hint of any interest coming from the United States. Because of this, Dornier.H was to be liquidated once construction of the Italian ships was complete, and a new company would be set up to directly manage the operation of the Do X-1. Dornier.H effectively ceased to exist by the time the Do X arrived in New York, but a new managing company was not immediately established. Dornier MB, the main company, was also in financial strife, indeed it was bordering on bankruptcy, and everyone was scrambling to secure support measures from the German government to save it. This left the Do X and its crew in New York without any real outside support. They couldn't sell enough of the Do X stationery to cover their expenses, a deal to charter the Do X for sightseeing tours fell through, and when the money ran dry, they were forced to abandon the Do X and return to Germany. The flying ship spent the winter in a storage hangar owned by Curtiss, and it was a cold, bitter end to what had been a triumphant journey. From the middle of 1932 onwards, the story of the Do X would not be that of Dornier's flying ship, but rather the German government's. As Dornier went through a restructuring process to avoid bankruptcy, a new government was formed to oversee the management and operation of the Do X, Deutsche Fluggesellschaft, more commonly known as DFG. Funding is immediately provided to bring the Do X back to Germany, and a grand tour of the nation is announced, where, for the first time, the Do X will actually carry passengers. It was a good plan. The Do X was an object of national pride, and yet it had barely spent any time flying over its home territory, and the German people were desperate to see it. Despite the growing financial troubles of the German economy, hundreds of thousands of its citizens were willing to pay an admission fee simply to walk around the Do X, and many of its more solvent individuals were more than willing to pay a healthy sum to fly on the world's largest aircraft. In late March 1932, the crew of the Do X, now supported by actual wages from DFG, and not at the mercy of postal sales, returned to their flying ship and prepped it for the return voyage. This was completed between mid-April and June, with the Do X heading northeast through Newfoundland, then flying to the Azores, and from there onto Spain, and then northwards to Germany. The journey took longer than expected, owing to poor weather along the Canadian coast. Over Newfoundland, heavy fog forced the Do X to abandon its planned landing point at Conception Bay twice. Running extremely low on fuel, it diverted to the town of Dildo, no laughing in the back thank you, where the crew made use of the town's only telephone to call in for the supply of more fuel. This was a significant event for the little town, and today a plaque actually marks the occasion of the flying ship's impromptu arrival. Once the weather improved, the Do X hopped over for a full refuel at Conception Bay, and it then departed for the Azores on May the 21st. Following a brief stop there, it reached Spain on the afternoon of the 22nd, and on the 24th, thousands of people gathered in Berlin to watch Germany's giant flying ship finally return home. Following a hero's welcome, the crew of the Do X immediately got to work with the preparations for the national tour. It began in Berlin on the 6th of June, with the Do X being opened up for paying visitors, and over the following 2 weeks, approximately 100,000 people paid to come on board. On the 23rd of June, the Do X departed for its next destination, Stettin. It stayed there for 5 days, and then, carrying its first paying passengers, it departed for the city of Königsberg. From an operational and public relations perspective, the entire German tour was a huge success for DFG. From mid-June until the 6th of November, the Do X crisscrossed Germany, visiting major port cities and anything else with a big enough river or lake. At the conclusion of the tour, after a triumphant splashdown on Lake Zurich in Switzerland, almost 1 million people had gone aboard the flying ship, and it had brought in a revenue of 316,000 marks. After tallying up the numbers, the Do X was found to have actually made a profit, but only just. Maintenance costs, including reskinning the wing, fuel, wages, and insurance, had taken the revenue of 316,000 and converted it into a humble profit of just 850. Not 1,000, just 850. Over the winter of 1932 to 1933, the Do X then received an overhaul at Altenrhein, but its fate was uncertain. Many people wanted it to complete another grand tour around Germany, but DFG was understandably hesitant due to the razor-thin profit margin. Some felt that the Do X might suit better as a floating museum, a grand example of German engineering that people could visit and explore, but one that didn't fly and cost the company a huge fortune. This line of thinking quickly disappeared following the change of government in the spring of 1933. The ownership of the Do X was given over to Deutsche Lufthansa, the flying ship was repainted in the company's livery, and plans were hastily drawn up for a grand European tour. The tour was to take it from Lake Constance to Lake Starnberg near Munich. Then it would follow the Danube from Passau to Vienna and then on to Budapest. After that, it would fly to Switzerland, follow the Rhine all the way to Amsterdam, and then conduct a tour of the Baltic and Scandinavian coast. After this, it would conduct flights over eastern Prussia, pay an extended visit to Berlin, and then make its way back to Lake Constance via stops along the Rhine River. Unfortunately for the Do X, this tour was to be its undoing. It started well enough, with the flying ship lifting off from Lake Constance on April the 29th, once again with Captain Horst Merz at the controls. During its visit to Lake Starnberg, it played host to several high-profile guests, including a surprise visit from Adolf Hitler, who was promptly shown around the interior, allowed to poke around in the cockpit, and of course was taken up for a personal sightseeing flight. Another special visitor was Claude Dornier himself, who went aboard with his wife and the entire board of directors of the Museum of Munich. This visit was recorded for newsreels, and in recent years the footage of Dornier and his wife sitting aboard the Do X has incorrectly been associated with the America trip 2 years earlier. At present, there is no hard evidence to suggest that Dornier was ever on the Do X for the first few legs of this trip over Germany, though he certainly saw the Do X leave Lake Constance on the first day. Following its visit to Lake Starnberg, the Do X took off for an unplanned visit to Lake Chiemsee on the way to Passau, and it was on this leg of the journey that everything went wrong. Chiemsee was only a short stop of a few hours, and the plan was to land on the Danube at Passau just before sunset. The Do X arrived almost on time, coming into view just after 6:15 in the evening. But storms in the area had forced Captain Merz to take a different approach for landing. He had to come in from the east, and this meant looking right into the setting sun. As the Do X approached the water, there was almost no breeze, the river was barely moving, and from the cockpit the water looked about as smooth as glass. This visual environment made it very difficult for Merz to judge his rate of descent, and because of this, the Do X came down on the water with considerable force. It bounced about a meter off the surface, and then when it came down again, the entire tail dug into the water and pretty much snapped clean off. The accident brought the tour to an abrupt end. In the following investigation, Captain Merz was cleared of any error, which irked some of Dornier's engineers, who felt that he had handled the situation poorly, but they were far more concerned that the Lufthansa investigation had put 20% of the blame on the design of the Do X itself. It was suggested that the design of the hull generated a suction effect when landing on smooth surfaces at high speeds. The Dornier team denied such a flaw existed, of course, but just 5 weeks later, one of the Italian flying ships would also be damaged in the same way, in almost identical weather conditions. Following month-long repairs, the Do X was flown back to Lake Constance to investigate the matter by orders of the Air Ministry. The tail unit was reinforced with a double frame, and Lufthansa test pilots were flown in to complete a series of water tests to see if the suction effect could be proven. In the end, it could not, and the verdict was that the near-identical accidents of the two flying ships were simply put down to the result of a high landing speed on smooth water, with conditions that made it exceedingly difficult for a pilot to correctly judge his rate of descent. Though the Do X was now ready for service once again, no service would await it. The accident on the Danube had been an embarrassment for the German Air Ministry, who had hoped to capitalize on the propaganda effect of the Grand European Tour. It severed the association between Lufthansa and the giant flying ship, and the Do X was left to float about on Lake Constance for the better part of 18 months. The government wanted nothing to do with the Do X following this. It was too expensive to operate, and by 1934 it was beginning to show the signs of obsolescence. Aviation was progressing at a startling rate, and after just 5 years, the Do X was looked on as something old-fashioned. Huge, imposing, a marvel of engineering, yes, but it was no longer considered the future of air travel. Indeed, it had slipped into the past. But, old-fashioned or not, the Do X was still a national icon, a symbol of pride, and a bold example of German engineering. Scrapping it would have been an appalling waste, and it seems that most in the Air Ministry never even contemplated this. Instead, it was decided to preserve the Do X, lest it rot away in its hangar or on the waters of Lake Constance. Friedrich Christiansen, who had commanded the Do X on its American tour, and who was now rising through the ranks of the German Air Ministry, was the one to lead the effort to have it installed as the prime exhibit at the new Aviation Museum in Berlin. The Do X left its home for the last time on October 14, 1934. It flew north to the Baltic coast and arrived at Travemünde on the 21st. Along the way, Christiansen decided to make a brief detour to his hometown of Wick auf Föhr in the Frisian Islands, where the Do X was made available to the public for the very last time, at least as a registered vessel. The Do X was then deleted from the German aircraft registry, taken to pieces, and transported to Berlin via canalboat. 18 months later, and the Berlin Museum opened its doors for the first time in June of 1936, and the Do X stood in pride of place. A footbridge was installed that allowed visitors to walk over the sponson, through the fuselage, and out the other side. It was the museum's biggest attraction, and had fate been a little bit kinder, it might have survived for us to still appreciate today. However, fate was not kind. As the Second World War progressed, and as the bombing raids began over Berlin, the smaller museum exhibits were gradually evacuated. The Do X remained. Nobody could spare the resources to move such a massive object in a time of war. And from 1943, it would sit alone in the shuttered-up museum hall, gathering dust. Approximately 6 months later, another famous giant of the sky, the Avro Lancaster, would send a high-explosive bomb through the roof of the museum, and it would land directly on top of the Do X. All that remained afterwards was a twisted carcass of metal. It was a sad end to the story of Dornier's giant flying ship. But what about the Italian Do X's? Well, their story actually ended 6 years earlier. The Do X 2 and 3 entered service in 1931 and 1932 respectively. Owing to the crippling effects of the Great Depression, Dornier AG could not afford to outfit them in the same way as the Do X1, and they were completed with more modest furnishings and a provision for just 24 passengers. Most of the space was instead dedicated to mail carrying and cargo. For a very brief period of time, all 3 Do X's were operational in one form or another, and advocates for the giant flying ships saw this as an encouragement sign for things to come. But the Italians would soon realise that the Do X was too large for European service, too slow for transatlantic routes, and far, far too expensive to operate. After a brief stint as commercial transports, the Italian flying ships were handed over to the Regia Aeronautica. They were mostly flown for propaganda flights and for public air shows, but the cost of operating them soon led to them being laid up and mothballed. Despite calls for at least one of them to be preserved, both flying ships would languish at the naval base at La Spezia for nearly 2 years, before they were both broken up for scrap in 1937, which was a crying shame. From a commercial standpoint, the Do X was a complete failure. Claude Dornier had wanted to make a large transport that would revolutionise air travel and make it more accessible to the common people, and this had not happened. A large factor that contributed to its high running cost was engine maintenance and fuel. Though impressive, running 12 fuel-guzzling 25-litre V12s was never going to be a particularly economical solution. The Do X was a marvel of structural engineering, there is no doubt. But the problem was, power plant development hadn't been quite there yet. And indeed, it would be a long time before big commercial aircraft became a truly viable endeavour. But the Do X had at least showed that it was possible for aviation to get big. It pushed the boundaries of what a flying machine could be, and it led to numerous advancements in the development of metal-framed aircraft. Before it first flew, few people believed that a 12-engined, 51-ton flying ship with the aerodynamics of, well, a boat, could even get off the water, let alone fly. But it did, and because of that, the Do X captured the attention of a generation. Unfortunately, its grand legacy is often overlooked nowadays, mostly because we can't see it. It's hard to truly appreciate the scale and complexity of the Do X just by looking at a series of old black and white photos and some grainy newsreels. But in the not-so-distant future, this won't be the case. Currently, as I speak, work is underway on a 4th Do X. Not simply a model for a museum, but a real-life, one-to-one, floating, functioning replica of the original Do X1. If all goes well, this 4th great flying ship will be completed in time for the 100th anniversary of the Do X's maiden flight. This is Project Do X 2.0, also known as the Do X Reconstruction Project, and many of you are already familiar with some of their work, though you might not yet know it. Their beautiful 3D blueprints of the Do X formed the foundation of the flying ship that we can see in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Building the Do X today is just as challenging, if not more so, than it was back in 1927. And at the start of this year, I had the privilege of interviewing the man responsible for getting this grand project off the ground. And today, we're all going to learn a bit more about the plan to get the Do X off the drawing board and back onto Lake Constance. Unfortunately, I've somewhat stuffed up the beginning of this interview, as A, I had originally planned to do this as a second video, but since then I've changed my mind a dozen times and now combine the topics, And in a moment, you're going to hear me talk about this video in the past tense, as if I'd already uploaded it, which is a bit embarrassing. And B, I forgot to turn on my video recording software for the first few minutes of the interview. So while we do our introductions, I'm just going to show this pretty image of the Do X so that you're not all looking at a blank screen. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I did. Hello and welcome back to the channel. It's been a while since I've done one of these interviews, and it is the first time in the new office, so enjoy the background whilst it still lasts. And today we're going to talk about something quite special. Recently, we did a video exploring the history of the Dornier Do X, and today we're going to be talking about a project to rebuild one today in 2024. But I'm not going to talk about that. My guest here today is going to talk about that for me, so I will let him introduce himself.
Yes, my name is Peter Kielhorn. I'm a former Dornier employee, and I have a little bit of fable about Dornier aircraft. Let me say, one is the Do-31. I wrote a book about this famous VTOL transport aircraft. It's really a challenge to bring that aircraft in the air. And I'm the initiator of the Do X project, the Do X 2.0 project, which is a project to rebuild this famous aircraft, because this is a challenge. I like to have challenge. I'm retired. So it's the best stuff to make my time during retirement. Okay.
Wonderful.
This is a project, and I'm happy to support Chris in this interview regarding the Do X 2.0.
Yes. And thank you so much for coming on. The project was something I didn't even know about until 18 months ago, and I just happened to stumble across a video, which I think is a video a lot of people would have seen by now, which is a video of the Microsoft Flight Simulator Do X, and that sort of got me interested in the project. And then I found the details of the team, got in contact with them, and Peter and I had a conversation a couple of months ago now, and we organised this for today. So again, thank you so much for coming on, and now I'm going to spend the next 60 or so minutes peppering you with questions, if that's okay.
That's okay. Good. Let me say about the project itself. We have two targets in this project. The first target is to recreate the blueprints, the drawings of this aircraft, because nothing is available. Dornier built 3 of the aircraft, and all 3 aircraft was lost. With this aircraft, a lot of, mostly all the drawings, the building drawings, the blueprints are lost. So the first goal of the project was to recreate these drawings. And the second goal of the project is, of course, to use this blueprint to rebuild the Do X. And the target date to bring this aircraft back available is the anniversary of the first flight of the aircraft, which is nearly 100 years ago in July 2029. Hope that works. It's a question of money and place to build it up. Okay, back to Chris.
Yes, well, 2029 is it's an ambitious goal. But I think it's one that is definitely something that could be achieved. And if it could be ready for its centenary anniversary, like you said, that would be something really special for all the people working on the team behind it. So when it comes to building this second, well, third, fourth Do X, what is the plan for construction? So what's being built first, second, third, etc.? Because obviously you can't just slap a whole heap of components down and assemble it all in one go. I'm guessing you're having to do it stage by stage.
Okay, we have, let me say, the big challenge of this rebuild project is to have the right place for this huge aircraft. It's 48 meters wide, 40 meters long, 12 meters high. So it's a really jumbo of the air. And to build it up, we plan to have 7 steps. 7 steps, which means to split up the rebuild in small portions. The first portion is the forward ship, the first part of the aircraft. Then the middle ship, I call it ship because the aircraft is a ship, as a flying ship. And the rear ship, then the rear control unit, the wing, and at least the engine pods with the engines. But one thing I have to highlight is we will not build this aircraft as a flying aircraft. This is, let me say, not possible because it's a question of certification and whatever. It's not possible. But our goal is to have a swimming version. The home of the Do X was the Lake of Constance, Germany, and we hope to bring it back on the Lake of Constance. I have a short video what the foreship is. I will show it now. Hope it works. I have to.
Oh,
so
yep. My internet is working. Yep. Okay. Yeah, it's on my screen now, so we can all see that.
Okay. And this one is the forward ship. What we like to build first. It's a big portion of the Do X, because it's nearly 10 meters long, 4.5 meters wide, and 6 meters high. So this is really challenge to bring that also, or let me say, to reality, because it costs a lot of money. Because the idea is to rebuild the aircraft as original as possible. So that means with the same structure of the ribs, the same layout of the ribs, the same steering, the same instruments, everything should be identical to the original. I will later show you a short presentation how we come from nothing to the detailed design of all the components. This is really a challenge.
No, that sounds incredibly ambitious to basically go and not only reconstruct the ship at a scales 1-to-1 scale size, but essentially building it in the same way that it would have been built in the late 1920s with the same exact components. How detailed will this reconstruction be if that's the case? Are we going for as close to original as absolutely possible, or are there some compromises that have to be made?
Okay, as I said, as detailed as possible. For example, we will reproduce the instruments of the aircraft, not functional because it's not necessary, but form and fit is identical to the original instruments, as well as the steering of the flight controls. It should be fully functional, also fully functional with the original aircraft at that time. But this is not necessary for swimming, but it should work. And due to this, I will show you a short presentation on that, how we detail it and how we work that. Wait a moment. I go back to the screen. You can see it?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay. Then the presentation, I will show you. This is let me say, the plan how to rebuild the aircraft. And let me say, not the plan, also the roadmap to go, which is a little bit in the past, which is because we start in 2013 to find out what material, what drawings, what images, whatever is available, what we can use to rebuild this aircraft. And in 2014, we start with the aircraft, with the reconstruction of the aircraft. And the first step is the outline. I come later on to the outline. The second step is the pre-construction. That means the definition and construction of all structure elements in the aircraft, which is, let me say, really preliminary. It's not in detail. It's just to know what we have to do in structural redesign of the aircraft. The third step is the reconstruction, is the detailed construction. That means to go from the pre-construction with further information, come to the information to the detailed construction. And the detailed construction is the, let me say, the activity to produce the blueprints. All the drawings, what is required to rebuild the specific ribs, all the elements of the aircraft. And the fourth step is the rebuild itself. So that means when we have all the drawings from the step 3, we go to step 4. Oh, there's a German word I see. Nevertheless, it's step 4, the rebuild. But this is, let me say, the challenge in money. It takes time, and this is the main topic we have to take into account, because most of the aircraft is in meanwhile constructed. Okay, how we come to the outline of the aircraft? The problem was we had to have 3 outline drawings, and the 3 outline drawings, every drawing was different, little bit different. So we have to decide what of these 3 drawings we use for the outline. And this is, let me say, a topic for a little bit uncertainty in the size of the aircraft. But nevertheless, we zoomed this this part or the parts of the drawings to the original size of the Do X, and this was the base, let me say, for the further doing of the outline. The next step was to, I have to say, at baseline material, we have hundreds and hundreds of images from the building phase of this aircraft in 1920, 26, 27. And these images are very precise, up to whatever. It's really detailed. And we know that, for example, from the fuselage, what is the difference between all the ribs. And so we could place the ribs in this drawing, and then we traced specific points of the ribs along the aircraft, and based on this, we got the result, or we got the contour of the Do X fuselage. So that means the problem of the original drawing. You can imagine when we scale this drawings to 1:1. A small pencil line is very, very big. So with this combination of the drawing with the images, we have, let me say, resolved a little bit the uncertainty of the dimensions of the aircraft. Good. The final result of the outline is like this, but with this we have a little bit also some elements of the further detailed design also in this image, because it looks like a little bit better. But it is let me say, the fuselage and the outline of this Do X, and we show sure that this this Do X is, let me say, nearly 99% identical to the original Do X from the past. Good. Here you can see, for example,
Wow.
the reconstruction. That means all the ribs, all the elements of the wing, everything is already in the pre-construction, which is, let me say, which did not use profiles and what is required to build it. It's, let me say, a little bit bigger. It was just to know what we have as ribs and as wing parts and so on. This was a task, combined the images with the outline, and based on the images, we did let me say pre-construction of each rib of each element of the wing. Then we come to the detailed construction. You can see here on the left the element of the pre-construction, and this is a relevant image of this part to be designed. Then we have a document which defines the profiles which is required to build up this rib. And of course, we need some, let me say, some experts, especially in the first time when we did that. This is the expert give us some hints about the thickness of the profiles. Let me say, a lot of insider information what we need to bring it in the design or in the detailed construction of this aircraft. And the final drawing is like that, a little bit precise. We have the complete list of elements, the number of elements, and we know what type of profile we have to use, because this was also this comes also from the image. We have this image zoomed to 1:1, and we have measured the one dimension of the profile. We know what the profile is. We go to the profile book, look at the specific position of this profile, at the thickness of the of this profile, and then we got the final information about what to use for the drawing. And this was the, let me say, the way to come to drawings to rebuild the aircraft. And this is again as original as possible. So this is at the moment the status what we have in October last year. Everything what is yellow here in this image is ready for building. And the gray part here, the wing, is still pending. At the moment, we work on the wing, and but the yellow part is ready. And you can see here some green element. This one is rib 44. This is already built, and here is also some green in between. And this is the central beam of the aircraft, and this is also already built. So some details of the rear control stuff. As I said, we have the original control facility also for the rear control, because this is, let me say, our goal to be original as possible. Here you can see a little bit details of the upper deck and of the cabin. The upper decks with the cockpit, the navigation room, the engine control room, the communication room, and the auxiliary power unit. This was in the aircraft. And yeah, the cabin. I think the cabin is not that impressive, but all the details on the upper deck is very, very, very precise. And let me say that was also the reason for Microsoft to use our model, because our model has already all the details what Microsoft has required for the simulator. Okay, some more details. What I said initially, the construction should be as detailed that we can reproduce the instrument. And here you can see the drawing. Let me say it's a little bit an outline drawing of the cockpit instruments. And this are the pilot panel, the co-pilot's panel, the engine panel, the compass for the pilot, the compass for the co-pilot, and some center information. Also from artificial horizon and so on. So that means this is already a result of the detailed construction. And this is, let me say, impressive because it's really one-to-one as the former Do X was. The same with the engines. We used an engine handbook of Curtiss, and we have a contract with Curtiss to use or to can use this data, but in the contract it was required that we did not rebuild this engine. So we can do it because up to whatever, we have all the details of the engine. But I think it's not our goal to have real engines in it. When we think about the swimming version on the Lake of Constance, we use electric motors to drive the propellers. Good. Our current work is the detailed construction of the wing. And here's some example how we can come to the original data. This is a knot, and a knot is cut out on the middle beam of the wing. And this knot is in a museum in Italy. We did a scanning, laser scanning of this knot, and we evaluate the knot, and then we get the detailed information about the plates, the profiles, and so on and so on. Here you can see the pre-construction of the wing. This is an image of the middle beam of the wing. And this one is a detailed construction of the middle beam, the backboard half of the middle beam. And this is, let me say, the first GeoFix part, what we got from the students, because we work together with students. And this one was, let me say, the first result. It is, let me say, 80% okay, 20% we have to do some modifications and corrections. But I think this is a good start for the wing structure. Good. Rebuild, as I said, will be done in 7 steps, which is one is the forward ship, the middle ship, the rear control, the wing, and the engines. This is let me say we start first with the forward ship to show to demonstrate that the Do X is to be rebuilt, or it's possible to rebuild this aircraft. The forward ship, as I mentioned it already, 10 meters, 4.6 meters, and together with the building slip, it's 6.3 meters. And here you can see the sections of the cabin, which is a bar that's very important at that aircraft. The smoking cabin and the passenger 7, passenger 6. This is already that stuff what we built. And regarding the rebuild, here you can see the RIB 44 on the integration table. You have to imagine this integration table is 5 meters wide and 6 meters long.
Wow.
So this was a challenge for let me say, for building, because up to now the integration tables was very small for smaller aircraft. Such a big aircraft requires bigger tools. This is, let me say, yeah, the topic of our project. And okay, this was the RIB 44. Here you can see the final RIB 44. This is the first part what we have developed and rebuilt. And the next part, I show it in the overview already. It's the center beam where all the ribs are placed on. This is the, let me say, in that case, an 8 meter long structure and 2 meter high. And the structure is 2 meter high. And this is the current rebuild of the forward part of the aircraft. The center beam, the RIB 44. And with this, I have a video I can show you how we build everything together, because this is very special. Let me look for the video.
Is that the one that was on your website? Because I think I watched that this morning, and that was really cool to watch.
This is that on the website. That's correct.
Yes. Yeah, this is fascinating.
This is it, eh?
Yeah.
Here you can see that's the building strip for the forward part of the ship. Here on the RIB 44, you can see how huge it is, and here the center beam in 2 parts. As I said, Chris, you will get access to all the videos, and you can, let me say, modify your presentation with this information also.
That would be good, because
it is on the website, and I think it's not really required to show it the complete length. Only a little bit forward. Here we put the center beam on the slide, and the second one on the slide, and then we fixed it on the center slide, and then we put the RIB 44 on it. And here you can see already. Okay, it's a really heavy plate. Okay, I think I will not further show this video. Again, as I said, it's on the website, and you can also add it to your video as you like.
Thank you. I think especially because my internet was struggling watching that and using our 2 cameras at the same time. It was very laggy. It's very much an Australian internet moment for me at the moment. So thank you. I will put those on the video in the editing room later on.
We will integrate in the near future other additional parts, and with the same procedure to have finally a complete film of rebuild the Do X, let me say, in half an hour or 2 or 1 hour. We will see.
That'll be really good to watch. And speaking of the rebuild, because we saw a couple of people in the video on that, how many people are currently working on the project to rebuild the Do X at the moment?
Right. Yeah, this is let me say, the idea also on the website. to give the impression. We call it. Sometimes I miss the English word. It's a. No, sorry, I cannot. I don't know. It's an special wording for let me say for the rebuilding facility. If everyone can look to it and can see what's going on that. And this is, let me say, the idea to do it in a museum where all the people can come, can have a look, what's going on, what will be built, how it will be built, and so on. And even if it is a small portion of the Do X, but it's impressive. As I said, 6 meters high. Whoa! You look up, and it's high. Okay, good. This is a little bit about how we come from nothing to rebuild. And let me say, even the construction of of all the elements, it's an highlight itself. But the rebuild is of course additional highlight of this project. Good.
Fantastic. All right, so I've got another question for you. I think my internet has recovered from its moments of doubt, because I had a warning that TeamViewer was thinking about kicking me because of my internet connection, but it decided against it, so I think we're still good. So what would you say would be, because we're doing everything to full scale, and as you've shown with those wonderful detailed models, everything's being done perfectly. What are the biggest challenges of reproducing an aircraft of this size? Because, like you said, the Do X is a massive aircraft, and it was the biggest in the world when it flew.
The biggest challenge of the rebuild is money.
Yeah,
it's money, because we have all the drawings. We can rebuild the aircraft. Of course, not the wing at the moment. We are working on a wing, but the challenge to do the rebuild is the money, because you can imagine this 2 parts is not that much, but it costs 35,000 euros, and it's impressive. And when we go with all ribs and all the details of the cockpit, it costs a lot of money. So money is a challenge. Building is not a challenge. We know it, and we know how to build it. We know how to, let me say, to integrate it. Everything is clear, but the money is a big challenge, and of course the place is also the biggest, one of the biggest challenge. Where to build the complete aircraft? You can imagine this 10 meters. This is a small portion, but when you go to 40 meters length and 48 or nearly 50 meters wide, this is a challenge to find the place where you can do it. But at the moment, we are working to come back to the birthplace of this aircraft. The birthplace was in Switzerland, in Altenrhein. And this aircraft was in Altenrhein built in a specific hangar. This hangar is still available. So we think about to come in the same hangar. But this is, let me say, a lot of activities, discussions with authorities and so on to make it happen. But we are working on it, because this small portion, it's possible to bring it in a normal hangar if there's some place. It's not an issue. But the complete aircraft is an issue. So this is a challenge. And also a challenge is to find, let me say, the right people and personnel to do the construction. We have in the team, let me say, there are 4 persons who are working continuously on the, let me say, on the design and construction. One is responsible for the internal stuff, for the upper deck, for the cabin, for the lower deck. One person is responsible for the structure, for the controls and everything. One is possible for the visualization. That means we have to produce advertisement. So and this is let me say, an important thing to have visualization, videos, image materials, and whatever. And of course, we have, let me say, a management authority, and we have the steering board of the association. This is the, let me say, the fixed group, and all other construction activities will be done by students here in Germany. And the challenge is to find every year a new group of students willing to do this construction. This is, let me say, also some activity we have to do together with the professors of the students. So we discuss the topic of work with the professors at the school or the university said, okay, I can provide 2, 3, or 4 students. And then we introduce, let me say, the rules and the requirements, what has to be designed, then the baseline, how to do it, and also some documents with all our rules. Because in the meanwhile, we have construction rules, we have interface rules, and everything what is required to get, let me say, correct information from the students. So this is, let me say, also one challenge. But again, money is the biggest one. By the way, in the moment, we had 135 students working in total of 37,000 hours on this construction of this aircraft. And not countable the number of working hours for the internal person, what I mentioned just before, the upper deck guy, the structure guy, the outside guy, and so on. Because these are members of the association and they are working for free all the time. And I don't know how much time they have spent now in the construction. So this is, let me say, all the construction, all the pre-work cost nothing because the students did the work with our supervision and that works. But the conversion from the drawings to the real world, to the rework, to the elements, that costs money. This is, of course, good.
So it's an ambitious endeavor as well as an expensive one, basically. to pull it off, you need the skills, you need the blueprints, and most importantly, you need the money. This wasn't one of my official questions, but I feel I have to ask: is there any way, like, any of us are able to donate to help fund the continued project, or are you currently not taking donations? Is that a thing you guys do?
Let me say, from the construction work and from the building, we don't need help. The help is really, let me say, the donations or sponsors that will help to bring it in reality, because it cost a lot of money. Yeah, and but it, let me say, it works. We are on a good way to find a place for the aircraft where we can first build the aircraft, and probably we have some good sponsors, and to get money, it's a challenge to do it. Of course, yes. The wish, let me say, finally to have it is high, is like that. I have to share again my screen.
Yep, here we go. It's gradually coming up. Yep.
So, this is that what we like to have. A swimming version with a hangar on the water and everything together in 2029, in the 12th of July. Hope that works. At the moment, this is a Blender version. It's not a simulator, it's a Blender version. But with this free tool, we can do a lot of, and you can see that it looks real. But the disadvantage is nobody is looking to that. You can imagine if such an aircraft is on the water, there's a lot of people looking at. Okay, this is, let me say, the hangar we like to have. That's the original hangar from 1927, 2028. And hope that this will be happen in 2029.
That looks amazing. And yeah, I agree. Blender is a wonderful free tool to use, and I use it in my spare time when I'm trying to. Some of my videos, if there aren't enough like photos of an aircraft I want to cover, I will sometimes use Blender models. I haven't recently because I haven't had the time to work on them, but it's something I want to do again. And it was really good to see the Do X there sort of superimposed on the water. And like you said, if there was something like that on the water today, there would just be a whole crowd lining the rails going, you know, what on earth is that? It is so big. Why are there so many engines on the wing? You know, it would be just a ridiculously impressive sight. And speaking of 3D models, you mentioned earlier that Microsoft used yours as sort of the basis for the one that's in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Is it basically a copy, or is it one that the development team made that only takes some of the details from the one you guys have?
Yes, Microsoft did, let me say, a lot of our details. They used the outline from us. They used the upper deck details from us, and the cabin. They have a little bit different impressions. We are not confirmed that what Microsoft has shown in the cabin section, but nevertheless, our construction, our model of the Do X is the best in the world at the moment, and Microsoft did it on take it modified for simulator because it's in CAD. Computer aided design. You cannot directly convert it to the Microsoft model because this Microsoft did, I think, from the time when they get the model to the final simulator model, at least 1 year. Right. So there's a lot of work from Microsoft also in this flight simulator model, but the baseline is our aircraft.
That's really fascinating, and I guess because your model is essentially a blueprint model. It's a model you're using as the basis for a physical construction, whereas they are just using it as an object in essentially a simulator / video game. So some of the details they need is going to be different from what you need, and I imagine your 3D model doesn't come with as much rigging, for example. So you don't exactly have all the parts that are designed to move with the press of a button, and that's stuff they have to program in themselves.
And let me say, our model is first, it's 1-to-1. It has to be for the simulator, and our model has all the ribs, all the details of the internal. This is not required for the Microsoft Flight Simulator. Microsoft Flight Simulator has the outline, the upper deck, and a little bit of the cabin, and that's it. But all the ribs and all the other stuff what is required to rebuild the aircraft. I think this is not of interest for the simulator. I think so.
I think a very select group of people would be very interested in it, but I think the general people that often tend to use it wouldn't be too fussed as to how accurate each individual rib and spar on the model is. I mean, I would be very interested, but not everyone is me and as obsessed with plane related stuff as I am, as you can see from the wall behind me. But no, that's really interesting to know, because again, it was the Microsoft model is how I discovered that this project was even a thing about 2 years ago, and I've learned a lot about it since then, and a lot from you today and with our previous discussions as well. And thank you for coming on and talking about this a bit more. That is the end of my official questions, but I do have an additional question I wanted to ask, which is, what is your favorite thing to do with the whole Do X project? Like, what's the thing that motivates you the most with it?
You mean the favorite activity in the Do X project?
Yes.
To smoke a cigar when the aircraft is ready.
That's perfect. I love that. That's great. I'm really hoping that I can see it complete. I mean, like, I don't care when it gets finished, but I want to see it complete if I can, and I'm very much hoping to get over there in the next couple of years regardless. So even if it isn't ready quite yet, I will hopefully be able to come and see what amazing progress has been made on the Do X thus far.
I think when you come in 2025, 26, probably you can already see the forward chip with all details.
That would be fantastic. For me, it's looking to be potentially Christmas going from 2025 into 2026. So hopefully that remains the date that I'm planning to fly over to Europe again. But it all depends on planning, money, the weather, what other projects I get carried away with between now and then.
By the way, we have, as I said before, one guy is responsible for visualization. Visualization means also virtual reality. That means we have the aircraft in a virtual reality museum, as you have seen just before on the video. And this is really impressive to go, let me say, in front of the video and in virtual reality, in front of the aircraft, and you go look like that. It's amazing. It's amazing. And with this virtual reality, you can see in detail how impressive this aircraft was at that time, because all the other aircraft at that time, 1929, was 10 times smaller than this aircraft. And so it's really, really, really impressive. This aircraft, to build this aircraft at that time, it was fascinating. And maybe this is the reason to rebuild it.
To get that scale in real life, but the fact that you can see it in virtual reality as well is really, really fascinating. And I love virtual reality. I've got 2 headsets in the other room that I use when I have the spare time for it, and it does give you a sense of scale and perspective that you don't get with things when you're just looking at a photograph or you're looking at a blueprint. You think, oh yeah, that's quite big, and then when you put the headset on and you look at something to scale and you think, okay, that is big. It's very big. And I just wonder what people would have thought when they first saw the Do X come off the slipway for the first time. Because by that point in the 20s, people had seen some big aircraft at that point, but this was on a different scale altogether. And the fact that we're finally getting to see it come together again, basically a century later, is amazing. And I'm very much looking forward to it being floated out onto Lake Constance, hopefully with
hopefully we can do it.
Exactly. But thank you so much for coming on and talking about this today. I really appreciate it. I know it's very late in the evening for you now, and it's very early in the morning for me because time zones, but we really appreciate it, and I will put some extra information on the end of the video after this interview as well. But for now, this interview comes to a close, and we will cut to the next bit. Once again, a huge thank you to Peter for taking the time out of his busy schedule to come onto my humble channel and tell us a bit more about the Do X Reconstruction Project. Now, if you want to donate to the project, I've put a link to their official website and the donation page down below. This thing is a huge labour of love by people who have a real passion for preserving history for future generations to come, and any and all donations will be greatly appreciated. Now, if you want to learn more about the Do X, I can recommend the following books and documents to read. So firstly, we have Dornier Do X, the story of Claude Dornier's legendary flying boat, which was written by Volker Baer. This covers the whole history of the Do X and has some amazing details on the crew, how it was furnished, and it beautifully recounts the Do X's international tours. Then we have another book, which is from the original to the model Dornier Do X by Karl-Heinz Regnat. Now, this was aimed at sort of model makers, but it also covers the Do X and its history in great detail, along with the history and the aircraft Dornier built leading up to me. Now, as far as I'm aware, this only comes in a German edition, so if you aren't fluent in German, you need to either get it translated or bribe one of your friends into translating sections of it for you. I've also got another book on the Dornier Do X. This one is by Heinz Nowarra. It's an older book, but it has some excellent photos and illustrations within it, and it has a couple of very rare photos of the full-scale wooden mock-up that was made before they constructed the first flying ship. Another useful document, especially if you want to learn more about the Do X, how it was originally built in 1929, is the official NACA aircraft circular. So NACA, which was the precursor to NASA, released a couple of hundred of these documents called aircraft circulars, where they basically detailed aircraft that were being built in the interwar period. And aircraft circular number 109 focuses on the Do X, and it goes into some amazing technical details on the construction of the first flying ship as it was originally launched. And finally, we have Claude Dornier, a pioneer of aviation, which is also only available in German, I think. This was written by Bridget Drews, and it gives an excellent overview of the history of the man behind the machine. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters. This video has been almost a year in the making, and I cannot tell you how relieved I am that it is finally done. It was only meant to be a 30-minute video followed by a 40-minute interview, but as you can tell, I got a bit carried away with my research as per usual, and we now have this marathon video instead, but I'm sure nobody out there is going to complain because all of you seem to like the longer content. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier supporters, and a warm welcome to Melissa Brown and Matthew Grow, who are the newest members of this special group. Now, work is progressing along smoothly on the next pair of big videos, and hopefully one should be up before the end of the first week in May. However, today's video did take longer than expected, and it's sort of pushed the whole schedule back, but hopefully everything is worth the wait. But as always, thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.